Hi, you're watching a special recording of again AWANI, and sometimes I have to talk about sad things, tragic things, and this episode is one of it because there is a crisis right here in Southeast Asia, and it's in the Philippines, it's in Mindanao, it's in Marawi city, and the only person I have to talk to me about this will be Boris Michel, right in front of me, the Regional Director, Asia Pacific for ICRC, International Committee of the Red Cross, and I just want to go straight to the point. How bad is the situation there, because you have people down on the ground?
Thank you for inviting the ICRC and to give our testimony on the situation on the ground and the work we are doing there. Marawi is located in Mindanao in the south of the Philippines, and it's always quite an issue when fighting is taking place in an urban environment. Marawi is a small city, yes, and it seems that the extent of the damage on the infrastructures, the houses, has led to a humanitarian tragic situation where hundreds of thousands of people had to take the road. We talk about between 360, 400,000 people on the roads who have to leave everything behind and who have to survive with the means they find on their road. So many have been displaced and accommodated in the neighborhood. Some are now located in evacuation centers where they are taken care of by us, the Philippine Red Cross or the authorities. And some are still in dire needs of humanitarian assistance, basic assistance, that is water, medicine, health, and shelter.
I'm made to understand, yes, it's tragic for people who have to leave everything behind, but I'm made to understand, I might be wrong, that at least they're the lucky ones. There are those who are still stuck there, right in the middle of crisis, fearing every second, waiting for another bullet to whiff by or masked gunmen coming their way, and mental torture is one, but they don't even know how they can survive. How do you reach into the red zone of the conflict area and ascertain that no one will be left behind, because there are reports of some being left behind?
Yeah, that's a big challenge for us in Marawi city at the moment, but also in plenty of other areas in the world. I just would like to mention, because I was there also, Syria, Aleppo, Homs, where you have a lot of civilian population trapped into besieged areas and who end up being caught in the armed conflict, even though they are civilians and they have nothing to do with the fighting going around. So the role of the ICRC, first of all, by essence and by definition, is to make sure that it enters into contact with all the belligerents, be they regular armed forces or non-state armed groups, in order to make sure that they respect elementary rules of international humanitarian law that is created and that is there to protect civilians from the adverse effects of the conflict. So we have to engage with the belligerents and try to negotiate the protection of the civilians, their way out if possible, so that they can reach safe areas, and then the military, let's say, dimension can keep going. But it's true that people are still trapped. I don't know the figures, but
I've seen the number around 200 we mentioned. Is that fair?
Apparently around this number, even though it's difficult to verify.
Okay.
But what I would like to say also is that before the present moment, ICRC and the Philippine Red Cross has contributed to the evacuation out of the city of several hundreds families, children, women, men, civilians who have nothing to do in there.
Okay. I'll come back to the term belligerent side, but maybe it's good to paint a picture of Marawi. It's, you know, right there beside the lake. And why is it so difficult to move people out of a city? Because people would be imagining tarred roads, maybe even a small highway, and a lot of cars and motorbikes to ferry them out. What is the difficulty in even moving people out of Marawi?
Yeah, you know, as often in urban or city warfare, you have the different belligerents occupying some parts of the territory, setting up checkpoints, controlling the traffic, and people, civilians who are trapped in the middle, they cannot that easily take the road past these checkpoints. It's not always easy. So when they are trapped, they are trapped. Sometimes the mere evacuation cannot take place because there is active fighting going on, shelling, sniper shooting, and that's really when it is important for us to remind those involved in the shooting, in the fighting, that they should at some point let the civilian go out, and sometimes it takes a lot of time.
Just to rewind a bit, it's not like the kind of warfare where the city inhabitants would be given time to leave the city. This is a conflict that has just erupted without any prior warning, and civilians are even said to be targeted casualties by, I don't know which side, but that's what I'm reading reports about.
Yeah, very often civilian population is caught by surprise, because if they were informed that any military activity would about to take place, maybe those who are engaged into it would lose their I would say, tactical advantage, and that's really a problem for the population. According to the rules, in an ideal world, yes, there should be warnings for the population to escape and to flee before it takes place, but in the modern warfare, this is not taking place very often, unfortunately.
Cool. I have to go for the first break, but once we're back, you mentioned that ICRC has to talk to any sides that's involved in the conflict, and you use the term belligerent groups. How do you manage to do this? Because in the modern warfare, as you alluded to, and we're seeing the term terrorism being mentioned again and again for the Malta group, and is there still respect for the rule of law? If there was, there wouldn't be this issue in the first place of civilians dying and suffering, and now we don't even know whether those who are trapped, and even for those who has escaped, whether they can get enough food, because it's in a lockdown, martial law, and no food production, no economic activities can be done like usual. So let's talk about that right after the short break. You are still watching a very special recording of Agenda AWANI thanks to Boris Michel. He is in charge of ICRC for Asia Pacific. That means that he has to look closely and handle the humanitarian crisis in Marawi and Mindanao. And you've shared with us a bit. And I remember I went to volunteer in post-tsunami Aceh 3 days after the tsunami hit. And even though we're not like ICRC, a small ragtag group of volunteers, the night before we go to, the term, local term for that was evacuasi, to take out dead bodies and find people who still need help. We've got to meet the TNI, which is the Tentera Nasional Indonesia, and we've got somehow to find ways to talk to GAM, Gerakan Aceh Merdeka, the so-called, by Jakarta's term, rebel group, or freedom fighter by the definition of the Acehnese. So I imagine it's almost the same thing for ICRC. If you were to go into an area in Marawi, both sides need to be notified so that you don't fight at that time that I'm going in to help people. This is not a military strategy or movement or tactic or whatever it is. But in a crisis where the word terrorism has been mentioned, and in terrorism everything is game. You can just turn around a civilian plane loaded with hundreds of people and just crash it into a tower where people are walking. So how could rules of law and certainty of respect be talked about in a place like Marawi now?
Yes. So I think to this complex question we can answer rather simply. There is a body of law that is called international humanitarian law. That applies in international armed conflict, but also in non-international armed conflict, as is the case in Marawi or at the time in Indonesia, where, by the way, I was head of delegation at the time.
Didn't mean that, yeah.
It's simple. all those who carry weapons and who are engaged in hostilities have to abide by the rules of war. And they have first and foremost to protect and preserve civilians, and they have to use and engage in hostilities in a way that is proportionate and that is respectful and that is creating the less possible damage to the civilian population. And this rule applies to every weapon bearer, whether you call it terrorist, belligerent, non-state armed group, or whether we talk about regular armed forces, the same obligation apply to all those who carry weapons. So starting from there, we have the mandate to teach about these rules to those who may not know them. Usually the regular armies, they have a curriculum during their study or training, and they learn about it. In the case of non-state armed groups or rebel groups, whatever you call them, it's less often the case because they did not automatically went through training. So we will play this role of disseminating the basic rules, and to do so we need to receive the clearance from the state and from the environment to reach out to these groups and try to sensitize them about their responsibility vis-à-vis their own population most of the time, because we are talking about civilians of the place. And that's the work we do all over the world, and sometimes it's very complicated or challenging, I must admit.
How challenging is it in Marawi right now?
In Marawi, it's challenging in the sense that the situation is very fluid. You are not talking about only one group. We talk about sometimes several groups. Sometimes they are changing names. Sometimes they are shifting alliances or groupings. And it's true that for us to have a good understanding of this fluid situation is sometimes challenging. On the other hand, to reach there, it takes also clearances from the authorities on the spot. And it's true sometimes that it's not easy, and you cannot just obtain these clearances from one day to another. I think the best way to overcome all these challenges is to secure in the long term, and as is the case in Mindanao in particular, a long-term presence where the ICRC is well known by its environment. We have an office in Cotabato, we have one in Zamboanga, we are also in a third place in Davao. And being there since many years, many people get to know us, the military, the police get to know us, and all kind of people belonging to groups also got to know us since that time. And it helps us also reach out and be respected, because we have to be respected, because we have to operate safely.
Correct. What are the main challenges technically? Is it about getting the right medical expertise with the right medical tools and, you know, medicine? What is it right now for those still trapped and for those who have managed to get out but still under lockdown and martial law?
So I think the action of the ICRC, first of all, is multidisciplinary. We are not only delivering health response, we are trying to covering all the needs of the affected populations. So first and foremost, what we will do is to carry out a very precise assessment of the needs of the people. We are a needs-based organization, and we try to design our response in a multidisciplinary way, covering as many needs as possible at the same time. So presently in Marawi, just after escape or fleeing, people need basic things. That is shelter, that is water, that is first aid when necessary if people are wounded, that is primary health care, that is food, and that is very basic assistance. This is valid for the newly displaced, but that is also valid for all the communities who are hosting these displaced people, because they also bear the brunt and the economic brunt of those populations joining them.
I have to go for the last break, but once we're back, I want to talk about hope.
Yes.
Sometimes it's so, you know, negative to talk about all the problems. So yes, the problems are there, but there's always hope. And what kind of hope is being built for those who are still trapped, for those who have been displaced, but wanting to start again? You know, life goes on regardless of whether the conflict is settled or not. So how do you read into the psyche of the locals in Marawi? And how do you remain neutral when the enemy sometimes is not distinguishable to any side? Because if we talk about terrorism, for example, it can just be anyone. This is not people in uniform. They don't use conventional means. It's almost whatever works for survival. So I guess it's a bit more challenging than the World War II kind of era where we have clear demarcation of lines. Here in a chaotic city, you don't know who is who. So how do you manage your team with all these things and yet still bring and build hope for the future? We'll discuss after the short break. You are still watching a very special recording of Agenda AWANI. We're still discussing the crisis, the humanitarian crisis in Marawi, and let's talk about hope now. Two segments we're talking about gloomy subject and stuff that needs to be talked about, but let's build on hope. At least the number of people suspected to be still trapped is getting smaller and smaller compared to before. At least the displaced now have more than 13 centers where they are housed, at least by ICRC alone. But a lockdown is still a lockdown. Martial law is still martial law. Bullets are still flying. There are even reports that dead bodies has not been buried. So that's how bad it is. But how do you build hope? How do you bring some semblance of normalcy? Because people who have been out of the center of the conflict must continue to rebuild their lives.
It's a very complex issue to talk about hope in the middle of a conflict, especially when the conflict has been protracted for many years, that some perspectives of peace agreement, peace negotiation were starting, then stalling again, and suddenly it erupts in a new wave of violence. I think for ICRC, to bring hope is the most crucial thing to do on top of all humanitarian activities and physical and material activities we can bring. I think treating people with dignity, in proximity with them, listening to them, being close to them and by them is the first relief you can bring them. Then you have to be professional in the response. You have to target specific needs, and then you have also to engage with local authorities, armed groups, so that they contribute to the dignity people need to envisage their future. And then we have to be very active with our teams, national colleagues, the National Red Cross, local authorities, to discuss together the way they want to think in terms of the future. When people are detained, you have to make sure that one day they will be visited and they will receive news from their families. When dead bodies are not buried with dignity, you have to make sure that they are being handled properly and that the families are informed about the burial. There are so many things you have to do in order to restore hope, and before the politicians and the politics of the context brings peace back.
I've read reports where this is a complex issue, but there are fears of religious sectarian lines here. And Mindanao has always had that in the history of the conflict. So how would ICRC, with some of, if not many, of your team members will be coming from the outside. So how do you operate and get trust and integrate seamlessly into the day-to-day of this conflict area?
I think religion is certainly a factor into this situation, and we have to keep it in mind and for sure make sure that the response we provide respects let's say, the religious factors and the origins of the people, treating them equally. That's why I come back to this notion of needs-based. Those are the needs which will determine the response we will give. And if needs are more in one part than another, we'll have also to carefully balance the response in order to make sure that our assistance in one direction will not create an adverse or a negative sentiment elsewhere. So beyond, let's say, the assessment of the needs-based, we also have to be careful about which environment we are evolving in, and at the same time we have to be very principled in our approach. We have to keep our neutrality, independence and impartiality in the response running. Otherwise we expose ourselves to criticism and we lose credibility.
Has
so
there been
it's quite
a challenge
a challenge.
on that in Marawi?
No, it's part of the daily ICRC concerns all over the world, all the time.
Cool. It's still bad, but there are more slivers of hope for Marawi?
More?
Slivers of hope, rays of hope?
I think we always have to keep hope as an objective. I think all conflicts see an end sooner or later. It's true that nowadays we have more and more protracted conflict without solutions, but I think in the situation of Marawi, and hopefully the situation will calm down in the city.
How can the layman help? People who are watching at home, listening in, how can they help?
I think people have to show solidarity. I think if they are interested and show solidarity to the fate of the people there, they can consult the ICRC website, they can contribute to the National Red Cross, they can also use the social network to encourage and also show to the people displaced and affected by the conflict that many people are thinking about them.
I don't have enough time, because since you look at Asia Pacific, I would also like for the next discussion to be about the Rohingyas. That's another issue that is very close to the heart of people here. But that's all the time we have for now. I'm sure Boris Michel will come again when he can. Thank you so much to you and your team for putting some sense and sanity back into the insanity of today, even in this region. You can send in your own views to all the social media platforms that we have, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or you can download our iOS and Android application. You can watch and give your own views while you're viewing it on your favorite mobile gadget. That's it from me. Good night and goodbye. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.